All right, hi. I'm going to start lesson two now. And with lesson two, it would be really helpful for you to have Moodle open on your screen at some point so that when I refer to the different documents, we're going to be taking a look at an IEP, several actually, and some IFSPs as we go through this. This is going to be a kind of intense presentation that has a lot of parts, and so I'm going to encourage you to take it in sections if you need to so that you can really absorb the process of what I'm going through. Because what I'm going to talk to you about is that entire IDEA process that is mandated by law, starting with that every child that has a disability is to be sought out and found by the school district. That is, the school must make an effort to find those kids. All right, so let's get started. And the first thing that we're going to take a look at is you look at this graphic. So to help you kind of understand where we're going to start with child find, then we're going to move into the referral process, the evaluation process, and the eligibility process of special education. So let's talk first about child find. Child find is this definition, and whenever you see these funky little symbols and all that, this is actually legalese that is in the intent of the IDEA. And so child find is mandated, and this is the actual wording of the law. So all children with disabilities residing in the state, including children with disabilities attending private schools, so there's where the private schools get their support, regardless of the severity of their disabilities. So, we might think severe disabilities, that's easy, right? But this is actually addressing the fact that we can have a student with a mild disability that has a right to services. So, and if they're in need of special education, or we believe that they're in need of special education, then they need to be identified. They need to be located and evaluated, and then some sort of method to determine if they need services. So when we talk about the idea that they need to be identified, who would identify these kiddos? Well, you as a general ed classroom teacher might say, hey, this student isn't performing, and based on some criteria that I have, and therefore I believe that it would be important for this child to be assessed for a learning disability. So a gen ed teacher. A special ed teacher in the school that is working in the classroom and might be observing things might be able to refer them. A parent can also refer their child for special education. So the referral can really come from anywhere. So anybody that wants the child to be studied or reviewed can refer them to special education services. Then once they're identified, they need to be located, they need to be found, and they need to be brought in. So what school are they at, where are they at, what program are they in, and then working with that. And then evaluation. And this evaluation isn't the evaluation of a full assessment, but what's happening here is a team of people decide, do we think there is something going on here? Should we proceed with the next step of identification? And this is called child find. This might be a child study team at your school. And in the world of special education right now, the system that we use to identify kids for special education is pretty much this referral process. They go straight from this child study, child find team to either getting assessed or not getting assessed. And what happened is that people felt that, something's not quite working right here. We're missing some students. And so there's another way that child find and referral happens. So what I'm going to talk about first is the traditional way that child find is done. So when we have a child find, what has to happen before the student can even be considered for special education testing is that the pre-referral interventions must happen. So I will bring to class the next time we meet I call it my red book, but it's a book that lists all different kinds of pre-referrals that students, that you might intervene with a student to see if it works. If the intervention works, then we're saying, maybe there's a need here that needs to be further addressed. If the intervention doesn't work, we might try another one. But what the child study team wants to see is that the teacher or the referring school has done at least 6 weeks of trying to find out what the problem is or fix the problem with these interventions on their own. So about 6 weeks, and it's not hard and fast, but they want to see a history of interventions used on the child. So what might be some interventions that they might use? Well, when I'll show you this manual in class next week, or the week after I should say, but in this manual, let's say I open it up to it, the child is having difficulty following along during a presentation. Well, one of the interventions might be that the teacher gives them a copy of the presentation for their desk. This is just an example. That's an intervention. And that those things are all documented. And so these documented interventions must be shown to that child study team before they decide what the next thing is going to be. So it's quite a bit of a process. All right, so let's take a look at what some of the evidence also could be. I'm going to take you to this website. I didn't study it before I started this presentation, so hopefully it opens for me, but it does. This is a really cool website that I would encourage you to take a look at no matter when, for what purposes, other things besides what we're talking about here. But this is called the What Works Clearinghouse, and what I love about this clearinghouse is that you can go into here and you can say, I need to find a strategy, or I want an idea for helping my English language learner with this skill, or I want to find a way to help this child with this behavior. You can see there's all sorts of different things that they have in here. But we're going to take a look at youth and children with disabilities. And when we get to that tab, we even get specific. Okay, what might be some of the things that we're taking a look at? So this child is, I thought it said up here, yep. I'm going to try that again. You should be able to search in here for specifically what's going on. This child is not fluent with their reading. And then when you type that in, you might get, here's a strategy that you should try. Remember, you have to try strategies. So it'll tell you, here's the strategy. It's called peer assisted learning. And then you click on it, and it takes you to the success of this intervention, and it's research-based, and we have to use research-based interventions. We can't just say, I think I'm going to try this and see if it works. It has to be an documented intervention that is research-based. So you can see as you look at this that the effectiveness in the alphabetics is high for K to 1, for comprehension high for in first grade, and then for reading fluency, they give it kind of a rating of a 0. It's neutral. It doesn't necessarily have an impact one way or the other, is what they're saying, that it didn't document much. So then you can also take a look at, okay, what is this strategy? What is this thing? And it will tell you what it is right up here. It tells you how to implement the strategy usually, and you can print it out for your file so you can keep it there. I tried this strategy of peer-assisted learning. Now the definition, the description is kind of short, and I picked peer-assisted for a reason, because it is. It just basically is where you're partnering the student with another person to help them read. I want you to write down this What Works Clearinghouse website, because as you do your case study, and you're going to start coming up with interventions for the student that you might suggest, because maybe they're having a fluency issue, you can go to the What Works Clearinghouse and find strategies that will really be effective for that student. Okay? All right, so What Works Clearinghouse, a great place to go for lots of different things. Okay, so I've already kind of talked about this pre-referral process and the team. Some people call it the child study team, or others, schools might call it the M team, which stands for multidisciplinary team. But people that are a part of this team are listed here: the referring teacher, other teachers the student might have, I don't know why it's doing that, supporting services that are relevant, like maybe speech or language might be invited, and administration. And then the other one here, I include parents and guardians. Legally, parents and guardians have a right to be a part of the M team, but unfortunately, I think for some schools or for some parents, the schools don't always like to include them in the pre-referral process, and I think that's kind of an important part for them to be involved in. So when we get to class, again, a week from this coming Monday or Tuesday, we're definitely going to take a look at the Red Book, and I'm going to show you how the Red Book works, and how you can look up different things in there for different interventions besides that website. Okay, so that's the traditional way. The traditional way is child find, somebody refers them, you document 6 weeks of support, and from there the team decides, are we going to move through the process? And remember I told you that some schools said, I really don't think that this is working very well for us. So what was developed is a different way to get the kids into the special education services. And next class period, face-to-face class period, we are going to go through a module that's going to teach you more about RTI, and I'm going to actually have you look at some RTI interventions. But at this point, I just wanted you to kind of get an understanding of what RTI is. Things that you're going to hear, well, basically RTI stands for response to intervention. So it's still using those research-based interventions to figure out, is this helping the child or is this not helping the child? And when we get to these research-based interventions, we start already in different tiers. We start at Tier 1, where every kid, if you read the language under Tier 1, all students receive this intervention. How schools would implement this is, this year we're going to try this reading curriculum, or this year we're going to try this math support program. We're going to try this computer software that we believe the kids should use after every math class to help them. So everybody in the class or those grades gets that intervention. And it's so no one specifically is targeted, everyone gets it. And so what they do at the start of the tier is they get a benchmark level. They figure out, okay, where are all the students? And they find out where their skill level is. They use this intervention usually for about 6 weeks or for a season. As you can see, some of the benchmarks could be considered fall, winter, and spring. So they'll measure them at these different times of year. After they've used this intervention, they assess again. They do the assessment that they gave here. They repeat the assessment to find out, do we have kids that are doing okay, making progress? Do we have kids that might need some more help? Or do we have kids that are really not responding? So what will happen is, generally speaking, the way RTI is designed is that after that first 6 weeks, 80% of your kids are going to be doing well. And so you're not going to stop using that program or that software, but you just have data now to say, this is working and we're going to keep using it. However, you notice some kids are not successful here. So what we do then, if a child doesn't respond to that intervention that we're using for everybody, called a Tier 1 intervention, then we choose a Tier 2 intervention. But in the case of Tier 2 kids, it's only the kiddos that don't fall in that 80%. So if they don't make it, if they're not still making the progress, hitting the benchmarks that they're supposed to hit in Tier 1, then we add to the Tier 1 intervention another intervention. And in this case, generally with Tier 1 interventions, it's whole class instruction. So when we get to Tier 2, it might be more of it's whole class instruction with extra support given perhaps by someone that comes in and reviews with that child. So it might be bringing in another person to support what you're doing, or it might be small group pull-out instruction for these kids to give them more time. So a Tier 2 instruction. And then after we've used that for a certain amount of time, we again give another benchmark assessment. After that benchmark assessment, we determine, okay, if kids that were our special Tier 2 kids, only 15% of them, or I should say, actually it's 20%, because we're taking this group and we're putting them. So not the whole class gets Tier 2, only that 20% that isn't doing well here. After that, we take a look at that 20%, and about 15% of them are going to respond to that Tier 2 intervention. So we keep doing that. So we keep doing the Tier 1 intervention for all the school kids. We do the Tier 2 intervention for the Tier 2 kids that are responding. And then we may have about 5% of the kids who don't respond to the Tier 2. So we put them into a Tier 3 intervention. So even more intensive instruction. If after that time the child does not respond, does not make progress, does not meet the benchmarks, then they're referred to special education. The beauty of RTI, and we'll take a really close look at this, I promise you, because RTI is being used in a lot of public schools in the Minnesota area. The beauty of RTI is that nobody falls through the cracks. Whereas when you go with this traditional model where you come and you just do the 6 weeks of intervention, somebody identified that child is struggling. When it comes to response to intervention, the data that you are using, the assessments that you're giving in your class, they identify the child is having some disability issues, some issues that are working. But you don't have to be so severely behind to get the attention of someone. You could be very mildly struggling with something, and you're going to get help with that as well. So our response to intervention is considered a much better way to work with all your students and then give support to some that need more. Okay, on the slides that I gave you, you're going to notice I gave you some hyperlinks here, and I will have this PowerPoint for you with the hyperlinks. But you can use different kinds of screening assessments for this, and I've listed a few, but the one that I'm going to ask you now to open up as I take a look at it, you can just type this in. It's called the DIBELS. And DIBELS is going to be the assessment that, remember I talked about this as one of the tests you're going to give with your reading assessment. So I'm just going to quickly go to the website. We're going to talk about it just a little bit. Okay. Where is this DIBELS from? DIBELS was developed by the University of Oregon, and it's all the materials that you see that I have, and I'll have these all linked on the Moodle course as well. All of these were developed at the University of Oregon for benchmarking, assessing kids to see how they fit into the benchmarks for reading. And DIBELS is actually a screening tool. So I'm going to open up, let's go first grade. And all the links to the different grade levels, I will have those on the Moodle course site for you so you can pick your grade level. But they only go up to 6th grade. So that's why I'm asking that you only use a student from 1st to 6th grade. There are some kindergarten ones in there, and we could push it if we needed to, but 1st to 6th grade would be great. So what you will notice when you get in to the materials that you have to give on the DIBELS, they're pretty easy to use. There you go. Sorry, now I went too far. And of course, to print these pages, they go upside down and right side up. I sure hope I'd be able to show you this. Now, if I was in class live, I could turn this around for you, but I can't turn it around for you here, so this will be a trick. Let's see what I can do. I'm going to try to get there. Hopefully you're kind of seeing this for yourself as you opened it. But these are the assessment materials that you print off for that child. But what I want you to see at this point is the benchmark page. So there's a page, are you noticing as I'm scrolling through, you can see it's upside down here, but benchmark 2, they had benchmark 1, and then they're going to have a benchmark 3 set of materials. And if you go back to the teacher's manual, I'm going to try that. Oops. Okay, I found it. The page I was looking for, it's actually right in the beginning of the booklet, so you probably saw it before I did. But what you'll notice is there's a benchmark 1, a benchmark 2, and a benchmark 3. So what we do with this DIBELS, because it's a screening tool that we use to assess their reading, theoretically would give this 3 times. We would give this test in the spring, fall, in the winter, and in the spring. And that's why there's 3 different sets of materials. So I'm going to be printing out one of these, and we're going to walk through how to give, for example, a DIBELS to a 1st grader. It's different for each student. But what you'll do for your case study student is you will print out the version that you need for your grade. So if you're doing a 6th grader, you'd print out the handbook for the 6th graders. you're going to record all the information, and then you're going to provide it to me, and I'm going to be able to go to the University of Oregon website, and I'll input the information to their computer system so that you can get the report created for you. But for example, if you are testing your student over spring break, you would want to probably give them benchmark 2 to see where they're falling there. If you give it to them later than spring break, then you would want to go with the end of school, near the end of school, the end benchmark 3. So you're not giving all 3 assessments, you're only giving 1, whichever time of year makes sense for that child. And then you're going to give them the different tests that you have here and record the scores that you have for that child here. What the DIBELS focuses heavily on is fluency. And so you're going to really basically be recording how fluent the child is at reading by marking their speed and their word rate. So the reason I'm showing this to you now is because this is an example of a screening tool. So every child in first grade in Classroom X would be screened in the fall. We would use our new curriculum. Maybe we're using Super Kids or some other curriculum that we think as a school is important. After a period of time, around the middle of winter or whenever we decide to administer benchmark 2, we administer benchmark 2. We record the scores there. This is where we're going to find out. Are there some kids that are not doing well and need more than the Super Kids curriculum? Maybe then we add a peer-assisted reading, or we add a tutor that comes into the classroom and works with them on their materials. So we apply then a Tier 2 intervention. We give the benchmark 3, we find out the child is really still not doing well. That's where we refer for special education services. Now that seems like a long time, doesn't it? That if you're going from fall to winter to spring. But we need to make data-informed decisions for our students, and so that might be one reason that we actually wait that long. Now DIBELS, however, also has what we call assessment in progress, and so they might give a test sooner than those time periods. But DIBELS is a good example of an RTI-based screening tool. I gave you some other ones here. The University of Oregon also manages the curriculum-based measurement on their website, and if you, for your case study, want to give another test, we could actually do that. So, and then you notice the Texas Primary Reading Inventory shows up here as an example. The reading inventory that we're going to give is also a screening tool. So I know that some of you are sitting there thinking, but I'm a secondary teacher and it's not really going to matter. RTI doesn't work for me. That's inaccurate. RTI is something that is also done in the middle and secondary schools as well. So it's definitely the same. We're looking at applying some curriculum that we think is important for all the students, and then we look to see how effective that curriculum actually is. All right. Take a breath, maybe take a break, because I know that was a lot of information to absorb, because next we're going to talk about the actual referral process. So no matter what we did in this child find era, if we used the traditional 6 weeks of documented interventions or if we used RTI base, we're now going to move into the referral process. So what is the referral process? If a child is not doing well and still struggling, then we get to the point where the parent, after those 6 weeks of interventions are documented, and we bring that information, or we bring the RTI information, then we say, let's agree to evaluate. And the team, that's child study team or that multidisciplinary team, determines if we're going to evaluate. Now you might say, well, why not just evaluate? Why do we have to have a special meeting for it? 2 reasons. First of all, evaluations are very expensive, so a district is going to want to make sure that they're spending their pot, they're giving the money of the dollars they have allocated for assessment to the kids that really need to be assessed, not just a child that's maybe should be getting B's and is getting C's, or the parent wants them to get A's and they're not getting A's, but it's really not a disability. So the team is kind of there to determine if there's really a need, and that's what those interventions usually do. But the other thing that the child study team will determine is, what are we going to assess? Are we going to assess them academically? Are we going to assess them cognitively? Are we going to assess their behaviors? Are we going to assess their social skills? What tests exactly are we going to give that child? So during this time, if we agree to assess, We get the evaluation determined and what tests we're going to give. And here's where permission form has to be signed by the parents. If the parents do not sign the form agreeing to assess their child, the process stops. So if a parent is involved in the child study eval team, great. They're generally obviously on board and want this to happen. But there are times where the child has been referred by a teacher or by the school for special education, and the parent goes, no, I don't want them assessed. And as sad as that might be for us as teachers to think, they don't want to find out or they don't want to know, the parent has the right to determine if their child is studied or not. So this is actually a point where the whole process could come to a grinding halt. Okay, so now we've gone through the child find. We did the pre-referral stuff, and so the child was referred. So now we jump into, okay, here's the evaluation. And I'm just going to, because you are not going to, as a general education teacher, you would not give the evaluations. And evaluations are generally administered by school psychologists as well as by special education teachers. We actually have a course in our special ed sequence for how to give these assessments. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what those tests might be. When I say cognitive assessment, that usually ends up telling me ability, like IQ. So we might give an IQ test. If an IQ test has never been given to a child, that's usually definitely something that's on the assessment. If a cognitive test has been given, we usually say after 3 IQ tests, we don't give IQ tests after 2 or 3 because that result's fairly stable. An IQ test that I usually give if I'm giving the cognitive assessment is something called the Woodcock-Johnson 3 or 4 or 5 or whichever version is being used. But there are others. The Stanford-Binet is another cognitive assessment. We will give kids academic assessments, so we will test them. So what we determine here is cognitive, what are they able to do? What are the gifts that God has given them in their brain? How does their brain function if it would be functioning at its best? When we give them an academic assessment, we're actually figuring out what can they do? This is their potential. This is what they're achieving. And generally speaking, when we have a gap between what we think a student should be doing and what they are doing, that's where we start to think there might be something going on. So that's why these 2 tests are very important. Also very, very important are observations. The special ed teacher assigned to this case, the case manager, will come in and observe the child. Any of the specialists like the speech and language or OT people, they will come in and they will be observing the child as well. We may pull in work samples. We may do a behavior assessment, watching their behaviors. Lots of times this will come in connected with the observations. If there's medical issues especially involved, or we involve the health nurse. And generally speaking, with the health nurse, we always are going to do a vision screening and a hearing screening to make sure that the child doesn't have a hearing or vision problem, and that's what's causing the issues. But that maybe we aren't looking at a special ed need, but we're looking at they need glasses or they need hearing help. And then sometimes we'll bring in OT or speech if needed, but not always. So these, I would say, definitely 1, 2, 3. We might bring in 4, 5, 6, and 7 would be the definitely last thing on the list that we might bring in as well. In an initial evaluation, we also would include, an initial evaluation is the first time a child has ever been assessed for a learning disability. So so this is what we're talking about right now. Never been assessed, we're going to be assessed. In an initial evaluation, you're also going to interview the parent and get a health history and a birth history or any kinds of history as well. Hyperlinked here is an initial evaluation report, and I'm going to ask that you move into Moodle and open up where you'll see that I have down initial evaluation report. And I would like you to open that so you can follow along with me. Just the initial one for this time. Okay, as we look at this, this is an initial evaluation report done in the state of Minnesota, and what you'll notice obviously is I whited out the district, but what would happen and what would appear in this box is the name of the school district. And you can tell that this is an initial evaluation because it says evaluation. The other one that you can take a look at is a re-evaluation that I have shared with you as well. And so this is the evaluation, the name of the student, their MARS number, which is their Minnesota student registry number, and the date of the evaluation is here. Also checked as initial evaluation. So when we look at an evaluation report, we're going to be looking at a lot of background information on the child. And I'm just going to scroll through and highlight a few things on that evaluation report. And then when we meet again for class, we're going to go through this in depth, because remember, you're going to review an assessment report. So this would be what you would see. So in an initial evaluation, you would see the reason that this child was referred. And you can see that this child is in 10th grade. So this is kind of late for an initial evaluation. So the problems, who knows when the problems actually started to appear, but enough concern was shown that the school district and the child study team determined that we are going to evaluate this child. So remember, I talked about the pre-referral things. Here's a documentation of 3 interventions that were used from October of 2014 to December of 2014. So a 6-month span of time where they applied 3 different interventions on this student to see if this student was going to be successful. Here are some teacher interviews. And the teacher, because this is a 10th grader, you're going to notice more than one, because usually high school kids have more than one teacher. So they picked a couple teachers. They picked their science teacher, their computer teacher, and their history teacher. Here's a review of the records. So here's this girl's grades. Now take a look at that. And as you evaluate, just looking at the grades and not necessarily all the information, but what are you noticing about her achievement in certain classes? Well, if I look at this, I'm noticing, well, she started off strong in algebra, but boy, each quarter the grade is dropping more and more. And as we know, in math gets more difficult as the year progresses. This is mostly reviews, so she's struggling with math content. But you look at her history, my goodness, that history grade is not great, and neither is her biology grade very great. When I see this and I take a look at that, and I know that history and biology are textbook-based classes with reading, I also wonder if this student might have some reading difficulties. That would be something that, if I were on her team, I would say I definitely want to assess her reading level. Where is she at with that? Okay, so here's the parent interview. Important with the parent interview, sometimes things will come out that the parents, there might be struggles that are going on at home, and sometimes that will come through in the parent report. Important to know with birth and development is to know if there was any kind of history, starting, were they deprived of oxygen at birth. Those kinds of complications are usually talked about. You'll notice here that she does have some sleep activity issues. She's not sleeping very well, and because of that, she is also taking an antidepressant, so that's very important. You'll notice what her parents describe as her behaviors at home. Then this section here are special considerations for when we're giving this girl a test. So when we test, remember, it has to be in their target language. And so as we look at this girl's target language, her target language is in English, so she is going to be given her tests in English, and that's referred to here. If there's anything else that might be needed, does she need frequent breaks, or does she need a different kind of setting, or who knows what might be put in here, just to make sure that when she's assessed to perform at the best of her ability. And then what you will see here are the tests that she's given. She was given the Wechsler, which is an IQ test. And then right after that, you'll see the results of the test. And we'll talk more about what these numbers mean when we take a really close look at the tests. But here's the results. But you don't have to, as a general ed teacher, maybe understand all the numbers that go on in the test, although they are shared, because what every report will do is interpret the results for you and give this here. So if you take a look at it, what this is telling us is that she is performing, I believe if I go to the very end, it says that she's sort of within different things, she's an average worker. She's some tasks not so good, other tests on the average ability, but overall, her overall score, if you look at this, her full scale IQ and her general ability index are within the average range. And then we have the academic tests. And remember, we look at the difference between a cognitive and an academic to determine if that child might need more special education. So we take a look at the academic functioning. So here's the Woodcock-Johnson that I often use for mine. So when we talk about academic functioning, we're going to take a look at her reading ability, we're going to take a look at her writing ability, and we're going to take a look at her math ability. And there's other, we can also give science probes as well with the Woodcock-Johnson, but we're basically going to hang in the reading, writing, and math because those are the main areas of achievement. So if you look at this, actually she's at 101 for passage comprehension, not bad. And her writing samples are kind of all over the place as well. So if you look at the interpretation, they're basically, she's low average in math and writing, in the brief math and brief writing, but overall she's in the average range. So my thought is, man, her grades in that class were kind of low. The tests don't show that she has a reading disability. Here might be her performance, so the MAP skills would be brought in and the MCAs are brought in, and the summary of the functioning. So here we look at any other tests, and because this girl was demonstrating some behaviors, they gave her some behavior evaluations as well, and they went through this, and it makes for some interesting reading to talk about for you. And the BASC is another one that they give to also show levels of, the parent rates them, both parents can, 2 teachers or 3 teachers will rate them, and then they compare the scores. And you'll look at what they do is they take these numbers and they kind of put them together to develop an average to determine, does the child have externalizing behaviors, things where they're aggressive or they act out in class? Do they have internalizing behaviors where they get depressed? Are they having trouble with attention? And when you look at this girl, this is where you see some real issues with attention being identified. And adaptive things are things like social skills and self-care. So that was all done on that child. And then the interpretation of that is given. The child, because she's a 10th grader, was also able to self-report. And so they interviewed her. They did a functional behavior assessment to determine how well the child is at managing their own needs. Yep, the evaluation report's fairly long, isn't it? And we get finally to, I'm going to roll through this because some of this is because she was a 10th grader, they were also determining what she might want to do for the future. So we're going to go back. Here's the observations recorded. Here's a summary of that. And then finally determining the related services. So what are the needs that we see in this student? The student needs to improve her behavior management, her emotional regulation, and her skills to transition. So this child isn't having an academic problem in school as much as it looks like they're having some emotional and behavior issues. So how are we going to support that child? So if we move to this page, we determine, first of all, are they going to get special ed to get help? And that's determined by the team. This child, based on her scores, it was determined that she's eligible for special ed, and her category for her primary disability is not marked. Oh, there we go. Sorry. It is listed as emotional behavior disorders, which doesn't surprise me. That's what they identified as her deal. So this child, as a 10th grader, is now being identified as special education emotional behavior disorders. And then we have a signature for everybody on the report, and report is complete. All right. I'm going to pick up and talk about reevaluations later. So although I have a reevaluation report linked here, this one's the initial evaluation, and that was the one that I kind of wanted you to take a look at. Okay, so let's return to evaluation is now done. So we have all these parts of the puzzle are done. So once that child was evaluated, as you could see in that particular case, the child was determined to be eligible for special ed. So how do we determine that? I'm going to give you a quick IQ run through, and then when we have class, we're going to go through the module that helps you understand this. But as I talked about when we were in Ed Psych, IQs are determined on the bell curve, right? You follow this and you go through this line through the middle. I think I can actually write on this now. If I take this line through the middle here and you look at that, that line is going to be average right here. That's our average line. And so the average IQ score is 100. As we go below, we call this the first standard deviation, and for IQ, whenever we have IQ, the standard deviation is always calculated in 15. So if a child is between what I just drew here, this area, this child right here is considered low average to low average. Now if the IQ registers from here to here, the child is considered, I'm sorry, I misspoke here. The child is considered average between 85 and 100. But there's terms of average, so it's low average. When we get to here, the child now is considered to be below average, and again, degrees of below average. So any child with an IQ between 70 and 85 is considered to be very below average. But you are not considered cognitively disabled until 70. Okay, and we're going to talk about this again when we take a look at developmental cognitive delays. So you'll understand the IQ scores. But a child needs a standard deviation of, the standard deviations are calculated by 1 or by 2. And you can also go the other way. You can go up 1 or you can go up 2. All right. So let's take a look at the next one. So I've got a kiddo that has an IQ score. I have to erase this, I think. There we go. And now I move to the next slide, and I'm going to notice that this child has an IQ of 100, and they have a reading score from their academic things of 100. This child does not have a disability. We think they're average, and they're performing average. Good to go. What about this one here? Here we go. Oh, it would help if I advanced the slide, wouldn't it? Oh. Okay, so if we look at this next slide under eligibility determination and you look at the IQ score, if the student is an 85, which is obviously, as I explained before, near the bottom of average, but they score on their reading evaluation, their academic assessment, at an 85. Again, there's no gap. There's no difference between, there's no deviation between that. Therefore, this student also does not have a learning disability. They're achieving at the ability level that they have. Now, let's take a look at this one. And again, I'm going to draw on this one. And I'm going to use a line here. This student is achieving at 100. This student, or I'm sorry, that student's ability is at 100, but the student is achieving on their reading test at a 68. So when you look at the difference between this line and this line, you can see that there's two or more standard deviations difference between the two scores. And because there is a difference of more than 2 standard deviations between achievement and ability, this child is identified as having a learning disability. So this is called the discrepancy model for qualifying a student for special education. It's basically based on the numbers. So it puts a lot of pressure, especially on the assessment, because the assessment is going to need to clearly show that they have accurately measured the child. And therefore, because the math is so tight and so close, they need to be able to prove that the scores are valid and that the discrepancy truly does exist. Okay, so that's the discrepancy model. So now let's think about this. We've determined, based on either the discrepancy model or the response to intervention model that we'll take a look at in class next time, we've determined that this student has certain scores. So as we look through the process, the parents or school staff request an evaluation, that's the referral. The evaluation is completed, an eligibility decision is made. And because there's no discrepancy like we saw back here, 85 and 85, one standard deviation below, but still the same, there's no gap, this child's not eligible for special education. If the child has a gap, as we see here, of 2 standard deviations or more, then that child is eligible for services. So we continue through the spectrum. Once that child is determined to be eligible for services, then we have an IEP meeting where the team writes an IEP and determines where that child is going to receive their services, what services they're going to receive, and so forth. If everything goes well and that IEP is developed together with the team and the parents agree to it in writing, the IEP goes into effect. The child then, for a year, continues on that IEP. After that year, the annual IEP meeting is held, and the parents then can either agree to the new things or the developments that are done in a re-eval, which we'll talk about in a second. And if they agree, we continue on with the next IEP, and this returns year after year after year. Now, when it comes to an IEP evaluation, those are done every 3 years. So at this point right here, this phase where you see the annual IEP meeting, usually that's done to see progress towards goal, and then every 3 years they do this evaluation all over again to determine if the child is eligible for services. Now, as you noticed over here, there can be times where the parents disagree. So first of all, we've got the not eligible, which takes them out of the system. We write an IEP, we determine places, but the parents won't sign the IEP, and that can kick them out of the system. And then after a year or 2 or 3 or 4 IEP, whenever a parent disagrees with an IEP, that can kick the whole thing out of the system. So there are times in stopgaps where parents certainly can stop the system and make the system stop for them. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask you to take a little break and pause, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the placement options that can happen for a child once an IEP is determined.